Sakshi Jadhav, member of the Interim Committee of PSA, and today's session is arranged by Political Science Association in collaboration with Nature's Club of Wilson College. The PSA is a student-led body that aims at sensitizing people regarding various socio-political issues and creates platform for developing discourses. Nature Club was founded in 1979. It is an environmental conservation organization and has actively worked on ground with students in activities like tree plantation, treks, etc. Today we are all here for the session Roar on occasion of International Tigers Day. Tiger is one such animal that is a synonym to royal or majestic. In India, we have been associating the tiger with being royal for centuries. That is why our national animal has been declared as tiger. That being said, tigers are now one of the species that are almost nearing extinction, which is why an international day is observed to raise awareness. The International Day is celebrated annually with the theme Their Survival is in Our Hands. Today we have among us Dr. Nandini Velo to deliver this session. Dr. Nandini Velo's work has focused on human dimensions of wildlife management as well as understanding rainforest dynamics in tropical forests. She has worked with local forest managers, policymakers in the Office of then Minister of Environment and Forest, and engaged on-ground outreach activities, including healthcare and logistical support of frontline forest staff around Pake Tiger Reserve, conservation education, and writing in popular medium. She currently teaches at Srishti Manipal Institute of Art, Design and Technology, Bengaluru. So there's going to be a question and answer round at the end of the lecture, so I please request all the participants to raise their questions during that time. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Sakshi, and I also would like to thank Aniruddha for reaching out to me in the past to speak before, and I actually want to thank him for his persistence in following up with me and making this talk happen. I'm very happy to be here and speak to all of you. Actually, it seems a long time ago, I was also a BSc student in St. Xavier's College. So Mumbai has a very close, we share a very close relationship with the city. And I'm very happy to speak to all of you today. And I'm going to be actually talking about a decade of work in Pake Tiger Reserve. Is my screen audible? Is my screen visible and am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, perfectly.
Yes. Okay, cool. So I'm going to be talking about a decade of work in Pake Tiger Reserve. And at the outset, it's obvious that this work has not only been done by me, but it's been done by a huge range of people who have been part of the team that I have led, I have followed, and I have got the opportunity to learn from. This includes the Pake Forest Department. This includes storytellers from Green Hub, my research team, some of who are present today and will probably share some of their insights from the field as well. So when I went to Pake in 2007 during my master's in wildlife biology and conservation done from the National Center for Biological Sciences and the Wildlife Conservation Society. And it was a long time ago. In some way, I had not attained personhood. And what I'm going to be talking today is some of my reflections from the field that tie to tiger conservation and beyond. So when I went to Arunachal Pradesh in 2007, it sort of got me hooked. And apart from the great biodiversity that exists in Arunachal Pradesh, what also got me hooked was the sense of community and the way in which communities managed forests. And Arunachal Pradesh is not only a very exciting place for biodiversity. So for instance, in the bottom, at the bottom of your screen, that's the Bugun Leochikla. And when I first went to Arunachal, it was a bird that was being described new to science. And it was the first bird species to be described after India's independence. And so there have been several other bird species, several other frog species, and in some cases, mammal species that have been described from this area. And as I said in the previous slide, about 60% of the forests that exist in Arunachal Pradesh are managed by communities. And from 2007 to 2000, this is me in 2017, with Chandanri, the field biologist of Pake Tiger Reserve, a very close friend of mine, and Kandra Bra, one of the longest standing staff of Pake Tiger Reserve. And it literally took me 10 years to see my first tiger in Pake. And this presentation is pretty much going to be what has transpired between 2007 to 2017, with some grounded insights, which is going to be the framework of my talk. So my talk is going to be rooted in 3 main points. The first point is having an understanding of the context that I have gained through spending extensive time in the field. So if you are looking for some some sort of generalities of what I might be able to tell you about India's development versus how do we rationalize that of the environment, this talk might fall short, because this is very much a field-rooted context gained through extensive experience in the field. I've also had, over the course of my PhD and my postdoc, and working with with people across the board, I've also had an understanding of some ethnographic and social context, which I will be talking about today. And the third point I will be talking about is the emergent themes and patterns within our research and data, which have informed some of our outreach activities and which have informed some of the science that we have done as we have gone along the way. So just to sort of put this whole framework together, today in this talk, I will be talking about fieldwork, some of the social context that exists on the ground, and some of the emergent themes that have been derived from the data I have collected during my PhD and postdoc, and some of the recent data we've been collecting as part of our research team. So this is where Pake Tiger Reserve is. It is in western Arunachal Pradesh. It flanks Assam. So here you can see that it flanks Assam. This is where the park headquarters are. This is, it has 3 main ranges, TP range, Sejusa range, and a range on top, which was newly formed. It's called the Relo Forest Range. It is 861 square kilometers in area. There are no settlements that exist in the area today, but there are people who live around the Tiger Reserve that interact very closely with the Tiger Reserve, and I will share some of these insights as we move on. So I was lucky to be in Pake in the early years, and I think this has also motivated me to a great extent, sort of playing a small part in the transition of a Tiger Reserve, where frontline anti-poaching efforts were literally people living in temporary anti-poaching camps, people from the local community living in temporary anti-poaching camps like this, or living on treetops, because Pake has a lot of elephants that often come to camps and sometimes attack people. So it was literally seeing stuff like this, people actively surrendering their local made country guns. And some of my friends also losing their lives to that of poachers. And this story was very much mediated and was very much revolved around a very central person to Pake's conservation story, that is Tana Tapi, a local Nishi, and one of the longest standing field officers who worked extensively for Pake Tiger Reserve, and today has ensured a transition from treetops to 30 anti-poaching camps that exist within the Tiger Reserve, 240 staff from the local community who are part of frontline anti-poaching efforts. Although it is starting, there is M stripes and extensive patrolling that happens, which then has a monitoring protocol by rangers and others to understand where these 240 staff are going and what they are doing. And there is also an extensive patrolling, road patrolling network, which enables easy access moving from the east to the west of the Tiger Reserve. So coming to the second framework of what apart from the field work and spending time being part of some of these efforts, the second point that I'm going to be talking about is the social context that exists around places like Pakya and Arunachal Pradesh. And some of the groundings for my social context have been spending extensive time in the field, speaking to people, spending a lot of time with frontline anti-poaching staff, spending a lot of time with local village heads, understanding what are the changes in some of the biodiversity metrics that they have seen over time, but also understanding that the word nature and how they talk about nature is not only about humans or non-humans, and is actually not limited to how the Oxford Dictionary defines nature, which is the phenomena of the physical world collectively, including plants, animals, the landscape, and other features, products of the earth, as opposed to humans or human creations. But spending time in Arunachal Pradesh and drawing upon some of the insights of anthropologists like Ambika Ayadurai and multiple others, when you work in a place like Arunachal, you have to understand what are the human dimensions of wildlife management, what are the metaphysical dimensions of wildlife management, where hunting is often seen as a world renewing process of renewing yourself and offering bloods to the forests to the spirits in the forest. So it's very important to understand these social contexts that are very different from how we may define them in the mainland, or even in the mainland, or even in like traditional conservation contexts. The other social context that is very important to understand is that spending a lot of time in Pakya, a lot of the destruction, and whether it is the proposal of a highway that runs that is being planned through the Tiger Reserve and several other places like mega hydel projects that threaten other parts of the forests in Arunachal, are not the work of people who are living there. They are not the work of people who are marginalized, but it's largely the result of the work of people who have BAs, BScs, lawyers, MBAs, and PhDs, such as myself. In some cases, not being able to speak out, or in some cases using our degrees to do the exact opposite thing, which is not taking the exact opposite measures, which are not in the interest of people, are not in the interest of wildlife conservation. So as I was saying in my previous slide, defining the scope of the social context that I have been working in does involve the human and non-human world, as well as the metaphysical world. And I've spent a lot of time using existing frameworks of memory to not only understand events that have happened in these forests and what people know and remember, but also create a logical sequence in terms of what they reminiscence about with respect to how they relate to their forests. So this is an example of a very interesting social context where it was just 2 decades ago, where there were shamans who worked in some of the places around here, which had where they had multiple species of different animals, including the tiger, hornbill, leopard, as part of their puja kit. And it was the visit of Dalai Lama when he fled from China that also had, where Buddhism also had a tremendous influence on people who lived there. And this is actually a picture of the last time a goat was sacrificed. This was a picture of the last time a goat was sacrificed at an animistic festival. And today what you see, the social context that you see, is that there is animistic beliefs that coexist with a lot of Buddhist beliefs. And it's also important to understand how how these transitions are mediated. And this is a picture of Dalai Lama, as I was talking about earlier, who, when he visited the area, and the people in the community coming together to welcome him and listen to some of his teachings, which included not hunting animals. And the final framework for the insights that I'm going to be talking about today are some of the emergent themes that have been of interest to me from a completely research point of view. And that is that of protected areas and community managed lands. And this is something that has been of interest to me, given that 12% of the total land area of the earth today has some form of protection. And if you look at subtropical and moist forests, and where this blue box is where Pakke and Arunachal is, about 20% of those areas have some form of protection. And when I say some form of protection, I mean that they have some form of protection between IUCN 1, which is strictly protected areas, to IUCN 5 and 6, which also includes protection by the community. And so if you look at strictly protected areas, it makes up a much smaller subset of the 20%, and it's actually only 5% of the total land area in subtropical and moist forests that are strictly protected, making it important to understand what are the responses of people within, what are the responses of biodiversity within protected areas and in multiple use and community managed lands. And some of the work that has been done in the past does show that protected areas are important. So it's not a dichotomy where, you know, we have to really be like it's either protected areas or community managed lands, because protected areas have been shown to be important to stop land clearing, but not logging, hunting, fire, and grazing, which are slightly more insidious and fine scale threats. There have been other studies which show that deforestation has been lower in multiple use areas. And nevertheless, despite studies showing deforestation being lower, land clearing being protected areas being effective to stop land clearing, the reality is that there is forest loss that is happening around protected areas and in community managed lands. And that's why it's important to sort of start to understand what are some of the benefits of community managed lands for wildlife and people, and what are the benefits of protected areas for wildlife and people. And one of the reasons Arunachal Pradesh is it makes it a model study site to have some of these comparisons done, is you can make matched comparisons. So there is often around protected areas, there are community managed lands that exist that are comparable with respect to their topography, with respect to their management, which allows you to understand what are the responses of biodiversity. So understanding some aspects of my emergent themes, like I was saying before, a lot of this work would not be possible with some of the amazing people I have worked with and continue to work with in Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary and in Pakke Tiger Reserve. And they also include people of all demographics. So I have a young team, and I also have a very old team, where a lot of the times my young team says that, okay, it's time for the old team to retire. But there are some aspects where in terms of data collection, in terms of memories, in terms of putting some of these a logical sequence of how people relate to forests, it is only people like Putulji and only people like Saila Bache who are able to sustain such insights and really enrich me as a person and enrich some of the work that I do. So just to talk about the fieldwork, the emergent themes, and the social context that exists. Finally, I think, you know, for any sort of grounded theory to emerge from what you do, there is no substitute for spending time from field. And ultimately, it is what this little board that was placed in Pakke reminds us to do, which is let nature be your teacher. So based on these three frameworks for the insights that I will talk about today, I will have three case studies. One is to look at examples of how we've done storytelling through the tiger. The second is how do we look beyond the tiger? And the third is how do some of the social contexts where there are people that make places and there are places that make people. And are there some examples of those social contexts which could give us some ideas of what tiger conservation looks like in Pakke Tiger Reserve? So coming to the first case study, this is about the science and stories of tigers that I'm going to be talking about. And what I'm going to be talking about in this case is also give you a brief history of how the first tiger census was done, to give you a bit of context about what exists in Pakke again today. So the first tiger census that was done way back in 1934. A lot of people think that the first tiger census was done in the 1970s, around the time when Project Tiger was declared, but it actually was done in 1934 by a forester, a divisional forest officer from Palamu division in Chhattisgarh, where he attempted to count, where for the first time he attempted to count tigers in his forest. And it's a fairly fascinating read to see some of his ideas that existed then and in some cases still continue to exist today. It's a short read and I'm very happy to share this with you all later. And I would actually like to thank a friend and a colleague of mine, Raza Kazmi, who has been an important defining force in terms of some of the thinkings that I have with respect to some of these landscapes. And in terms of some of these mainland tiger reserves, I'm incredibly inspired by some of the work and some of the stories that have come from Palamu Tiger Reserve. And as we go, and we'll just go further from that one tiger census to how did it happen across the whole continent, across the Indian subcontinent. And it pretty much happened in 1969, where Kailash Sankla went to different forest divisions and started collecting information from every state of India. He collected, at that time, he collected secondary information from Arunachal Pradesh. From any archival records, it was not immediately apparent where in Arunachal Pradesh he went, although he did say that he he walked from Arunachal to Assam speaking to forest officers, but he's not mentioned any of those locations, and I'm yet to find greater detail about that. And so in 1969, he did this sort of one-man survey, which where he reached out to his colleagues in the forest department and asked them about what was any information that they had in tigers. And he came up, based on that, he came up with an estimate that there were nearly 2,500 tigers that existed in the forests of India then. And in many cases, or at least what he says in his book, is that this was the basis of getting the tiger into the Red Data book, which is basically giving it a threatened category, a status where you were able to evaluate what were the threats the tiger faced and what was the current status of the population. Then in 1972, after 1934, 1969, in 1972, he again went from area to area all over Tigerland to check the authenticity of all the secondary information that was collected. And for about 2 weeks, I think in the month of April, there were 5,000 men that went out, men and I'm hoping women, that went out to count tigers during 2 weeks of April and May, and give us a number of what what were the total number of tigers that existed in India, but they also extrapolated to areas in Nepal, Bhutan, and other places. So then they had come up with from 2,500 of what he initially had estimated. They came up with this number that India had of 1,863 tigers, and along with Nepal, Bhutan, and Bangladesh, the entire subcontinent had 2,741 tigers then. A lot of the main way in which tigers were counted then was through this pugmark method, where he states in his book that each tiger not only had a unique pugmark pattern, but as part of the curriculum of some of the frontline watchers in the Indian Forest Service, they were also asked to memorize the footprints of some of the tigers that were found there. So when they were doing the tiger census back then, he did notice that there were some discrepancies and there were some inherent problems with respect to counting tigers in the way that they were doing so before. And this is what he said. He says that I collected a few hundred prints, but many of them were just irregular circles from which nothing could be inferred. Sometimes the footprint recorded on one day was different from the next day. The tiger walks a lot, and in one night may cross the beat of 3 forest guards, each of whom recorded it and made 3 tigers out of 1 tiger. So the overinflation of numbers was recognized back then, though there was a bit of reluctance about junking this method entirely. The picture above here, before I forget actually to explain, is one of the 100 prints that exist on a riverbank in Pakke. And the photo that I showed you a couple of slides ago with me, Kandra and Chandan, this was exactly the time when we saw our first tiger, and it was really beautiful seeing the tiger the way in which we saw it, because it was just a regular day of work where we were going to set up a camera trap, and we had found an ideal location, and to sort of, I guess, confirm that our location was ideal, there was a tiger that was walking towards us. And we went to the side and had a beautiful but brief glimpse of this animal till it saw us later and jumped away. So coming back to some of the discussions, going back to some of the discussions that happened about some of the census techniques, was that in 1972, when this was done, there was an acknowledgement that this was not 100% reliable. That's what Kailash Sankla says, but at least it was based on the best available facts rather than guesswork, as in all previous estimates. But some doubts were expressed about the methods used and arguments centered on the pugmark controversy. And some of these doubts were expressed by Sir Dillon Ripley, who was the secretary of the Smithsonian Institute of Washington, where he said in a press interview in March 1966 that I cannot believe that tigers can be counted by their pug marks. And this slide below is also an example of, sometimes in field it makes it very difficult to understand the difference between the pug mark of a tiger, pug cub, and the pug mark of a leopard. And although there have been extensive measurements of how they differ, they still have a high chance of being confused. So so then it took a long time, and it actually took a very, very long time, from the 1970s to 2011, where there was this shift from population estimation techniques and not really census techniques. And let me explain a bit about what are some of the population estimation techniques mean. So why was there a shift from census to estimation? This is why, because census, one of the limitations of a census is that it tells you how many animals you saw in the area that you covered, right? What is the meaning of sampling, or what is the meaning of estimation is that there's a sample of the population, and when there is a sample of the population, you assume that all animals cannot be counted. And in some ways, this is a logical assumption, because you cannot go to all areas and you cannot see all animals, right? So in sampling, you do assume that you cannot, the entire habitat cannot be covered, and it's literally like this picture, right, where you pick up a few grains of rice and you see you could possibly see how much they weigh, how many they are in number, and then estimate what this would weigh, or how many more rice grains there would be, rather than counting each and every rice grain possibly in a sack, which would be impossible. So sampling allows you, one of the assumptions of sampling is that all animals cannot be counted. The second assumption is that the entire habitat cannot be covered. And in what is called capture-recapture, you also get an idea of how many animals were missed, an estimate of how many animals were missed, and extrapolate and estimate what is the population found in the entire habitat. So this is an example, actually, just from I thought I would put this picture, but this is an example of just from my field work, where when we talk about sampling in multiple habitats and going to every single place, what the reality is that this is sometimes what terrain looks like. So you have to sample, there is no question of being able to do just as a census and count every single animal that exists here. And yeah, from some of those landslides, this is what, again, this is what it takes to actually get fieldwork done and to do manage some of these logistics in the field. So all of us have transitioned into estimation techniques rather than census techniques. So don't worry if you don't understand some bits of this. I can always explain this later. We can also always have a discussion and do some readings about it later. But basically what sampling allows for is to estimate a detection probability, which is the number of what are the animals that exist in some of these habitats, but that you might have not seen. So that is a detection probability. And what ultimately, when we say that we are estimating the number of animals in a habitat, which is here, when I say I'm estimating the number of animals in a habitat, it's basically an estimate of the animals in a sample divided by the proportion of the area that I've sampled. So some of these sampling techniques have been used in the context of Parquet Tiger Reserve. It took a while to move from census to having some of these sampling techniques done through camera trapping, but nevertheless it has happened, and I will explain to you how that was done. So this is this was actually done by, again, Tana Tapi, who was very keen and also in some case very militant that this would be done as one of the first northeastern tiger reserves come hell or high water. So I remember when I was doing my master's and my other field work, he would make it mandatory for every researcher, no matter what your study topic was, that you had to contribute to the camera trapping exercise for 2 months. So you had to give 2 months of your entire field duration and help the forest department in setting this up. While we complained then, there have definitely been some advantages now to doing that, because a lot of the staff have been trained in data collection, in data entry, And there was Chandanri, who was the field biologist who was doing the data analysis. So this is how the camera trapping progress of Pake was done. So as I told you before, the field context that existed was that in 2006, there was no patrolling road. There was a team that slept. There was a team that slept on the riverbank with the Wildlife Institute of India, because there were no anti-poaching camps that existed in some of the key core areas of Pake Tiger Reserve. And hunting pressures were also very high. So for instance, here, this picture is otter traps that were taken from the middle of, that were seized from the middle of the tiger reserve. And this was fairly common till Pake had an active patrolling network. Today, what exists is that not only are some of the staff able to do camera trapping assisted by researchers, but some of this staff, as you can see in this picture here, this is us also going and doing these expeditions to the northern ranges of Pake, to the north of Pake, to collect genetic material to count, to again estimate the number of tigers that exist in the park. So there has been definite progress in the camera trapping efforts made in this tiger reserve. So that was in 2000, coming back to the timeline, in 2009, there was annual camera trapping that started happening on a yearly basis. And again, this was done through borrowed cameras that we got from our research institutes, cameras from other projects, cameras sometimes from other protected areas, but there was a insistence that, we should get this started. And WWF also did help a lot in setting this up and pairing researchers with frontline anti-poaching staff and the field biologists that was there. And in 2002, from 2012 onwards, there was a field biologist, Chandanri, and the Tiger Reserve had their own cameras to do annual camera tapping that goes on to this day. Some of what this camera tapping has allowed for is that, going back to what I told you about Kailash Sankla and a lot of the early work that existed in India, there was no record of the number of tigers, the estimate of tigers that existed from Pake. And some of the camera tapping and some of the research that has come from this area has definitely assisted us in multiple ways. This is, I'm just going to take you all through a couple of individual tiger photos. This is the Gaon Buddha of Pake. He's been nicknamed the Gaon Buddha of Pake, one of the oldest male tigers of Pake, who is known because of, he's also known by this unique paintbrush-like stripe pattern on the right of his belly, where every year when this individual is obtained, it's fairly easy to recognize him. So basically, what camera tapping also allows you to do, unlike many other estimation techniques, is that it allows you to have a capture history, where every year you can have a capture history of whether or not you got that animal, which also allows you to not only get a detection probability, but tells you about, where are the places the animal roams around, and what is its territory, what is its home range. So these are some examples of the capture histories of some of the animals that have some of the individual tigers that exist in Pake today. Every year there are about 7 to 9 different individuals that exist from the lower reaches of the tiger reserve, and the estimate goes up sometimes to about 12 individuals that exist around in the 800 square kilometers of protected area. This is a picture of the largest tiger. These are pictures of also fairly interesting placements and interesting field knowledge that has been displayed by some of the team and frontline staff. So this is actually an example of a camera trap that was put at 3:20. And in 20 minutes, there was a tiger again that came. You can see this is where the camera trap was. And in 20 minutes, there was a tiger that came and was captured here. This is a tiger and an individual that actually is a lot of the staff in Pake, they call it the poster tiger of Pake. It's obviously an animal that is not trap shy. And there are some beautiful pictures of this individual that are got year after year. So some of the information on not only tigers in Pake, but some of the information and what existed in the 70s, but moreover, some of the information collected from the south of India, done by some of tiger researchers like Dr. Ullas Karan, have allowed us to answer classical ecological questions. So, for instance, one classical ecological question that exists in nature is, do predators control prey numbers? And do predator numbers depend on prey numbers? Right? So, is there a bottom-up control, or is there top-down control of I would say this food web, but basically looking at the role of tigers, whether they are controlled by prey or vice versa. So classically, a lot of not only with respect to tigers, but with respect to classical community ecology, is that populations of, when we talk about top-down control, what that means is that there are two main points, which is populations of producers, carnivores, and decomposers are limited by the respective by their resources, right? And a second, I won't talk about the second point, but the other overarching point is that when we talk about top-down control, what a lot of people hypothesize is that herbivores are seldom food limited and appear most often to be predator limited, and therefore are not likely to compete for common resources. So that was some of the hypotheses of top-down control versus bottom-up. And this seminal work actually that has come out from multiple tiger reserves from across India, where they have done camera trapping, shows that if you look at, let me first take you through this graph a bit carefully so all of you are able to understand. This is prey density on the x-axis. So as you go along here, there are more, your prey density increases. On your y-axis is tiger density, which is the number of animals per 100 square kilometers. What these are confidence intervals, which is where 95% of your data exists, right? And this here is your trend line. So if you look at what this relationship is saying, is that it says that as prey density increases, your the number of animals that you have, the number of tigers that you have per 100 square kilometers also increases. And you see that this is consistent for this is consistent actually for most tiger reserves wherein they sampled. So if you look at here, Kaziranga, it has a high tiger density. That's because it has very high prey density. So also Nagarhole and other areas. So this classically shows that it answers a classical ecological question, saying that it's not only tiger conservation that we should be talking about of that of the individual or that of the population, but we should also be talking about prey and the density of prey if we are going to ensure that we have high tiger numbers. So this also, this work that was published, seminal work that was published in 2004, Also includes sort of visualizing what was the role of tigers in that classical way. You know, when you had, this is Kaila again, our illustration done by Kaila Sankla, where there was the tiger at the apex of the biological pyramid. And although he talks about the role of tigers, we also know that the role from Dr. Karan's work, we also know that the role of these predators is now far more important than what we knew in the 70s. So some of this information in terms of outreach has been used by, has been interpreted by our team in some of Dr. Karan's work has been interpreted by our team of designers, forest department staff, and researchers in multiple ways. And one way is this simple game that we have with children around Pakke, where based on Dr. Karan's work, he talks about a single tiger eats 50 deer a year, right? And the tiger's at the top of a food chain. And then if you look at how many deer are required for that single tiger, he says that 500 deer are required to maintain a yearly supply to meet that tiger's food requirement, because although the tiger eats 50 deer, 500 deer are required to ensure that the number of deer remain constant in the next year, right? So this is classical interpretation that we've done of some of Dr. Karan's work, and also some of Kaila Sankla's work of interpreting what is the role of the tiger in the ecosystem. But we also have these little games that we have in a nature interpretation center that is visited by about 200 to 250 school kids from around Pakke, where they understand what is the role of prey. So while there are some classical questions on natural history, on who exists at the top of the pyramid versus at the bottom, there are also some further questions on understanding the role of the prey. So if you look here, how many deer does a single tiger eat every year? In Pakke, the estimate is that there are 10 to 12 tigers that exist in this landscape. So for people to have an understanding of prey and the number of prey tigers require in Pakke, we also asked them several questions about prey and make this interactive and explain some of the bottom-up control work that has been generated on tiger conservation. Some other information that has been generated on not necessarily tiger conservation, but tiger natural history. And, just some of the sensorial experiences that kids really get drawn on to have also been integrated into some of the work that we've done. So these are two cool natural history details that way back in 1930, Burton, who wrote extensively about tigers, had these very interesting quotes that we then went on to, the research team then went on to read further about to understand what are some of the tiger senses that exist. So one quote was from Burton, was, if there is a Burmese saying which says if a tiger had to depend on its nose, it would starve to death. So tigers don't have a very good sense of smell. There's another little tidbit that he has where he says, the tiger depends far more on hearing than on scent or sight, especially in closed forests where visibility is poor. So quite connected to Pakke. Hunters know the slightest metallic sound from their rifle will cause a tiger to bolt. And it is said that he can even hear the breathing of a hunter inside a hide or from a machan. And some of this information on, what are tiger senses have been used in some of the outreach material that we have generated for the forest department and schools around, where this is a poster called Sense and Sensibility, which has what are the different senses of a tiger. So according to that Burmese saying, the tiger had a very poor sense of smell. We've done further research, and it has an even poorer sense of taste, but it has an excellent sense of hearing and an okayish sense of sight. Not really good tactile sense. And so back to what I was saying about the Nature Interpretation Center that we have developed. We have worked with children from the schools around there and teachers from the schools around there to understand what are some of the themes that they would like to learn about. And we worked extensively with some of the frontline staff from the forest department, some of the teachers and educators. So this is my friend Sanjay Tisu, who has been working with the forest department from the last 13 years. He's excellent at painting as an all-rounder in the Tiger Reserve. And he would, sorry, excuse me. Sorry. So Sanjay was quite instrumental in helping us create this very interesting nature interpretation center around Pakke, and this is what one of the interpretation centers looks like, and it's widely used for different activities by some of the school children around. And to sum up this part about the science of tigers and the storytelling of tigers, this clearly also goes into what the wider vision we had for tiger conservation way back in the 1970s, where the Prime Minister's message clearly spelled out that the policy of forestry should move away from that of the narrow outlook of the accountant to creating a framework for tiger conservation where there was a wider vision for recreation, education, and ecological value. The second theme that I would like to actually talk about is that of how do we find narratives that move beyond the tiger. And this is important given that protected areas continue to be degraded. And these are some of the protected areas that I work in Arunachal, including Pakke and Eagle Nest. And community managed lands continue to face a different sort of degradation, but as stark. And if you look at protected areas and community managed lands, and how they respond, how species respond to the different disturbances that exist in protected areas and community managed lands. I'm just giving you a pictorial overview of some of some of the species responses to these disturbances. So this is protected area. This is community forest. In protected area, the sort of disturbance of vegetation that exists in secondary forests is that of disturbed bamboo. And like I showed you in community forests, the sort of disturbance that exists is logging and farming. And these are undisturbed forests in protected areas and community forests that pretty much look the same. Yeah. So if you look at elephants, the way they respond to protected area versus community forest is that they don't mind being close to roads, but they are in undisturbed forests. Gaur are in bamboo forests away from roads, but more in protected areas. So also sambar. Bears are again more in protected areas. And in the undisturbed areas of protected areas. Sero, same as bear. Wild pigs again are further away from roads, but in undisturbed forests, in protected areas and community forests. So also barking deer, which are again in undisturbed forests in both protected areas and community forests. And then there are a range of small cat species like leopard cats that are found across different disturbance regimes and are also found in protected areas and in community forests and don't seem to show any distinct pattern. Same also for porcupines. And when you look at how when you do camera trapping, and if you look at how species respond, large-bodied versus small-bodied species respond to protected areas versus community forests, what you see here is what I've done is create a bubble plot where the size of the bubble is proportionate to how big the animal is. So the expectation is if there are species found here in this part of the graph, they are mostly seen more in the community protected area, and if there are species found in the orange part, they are found mostly in the community managed land. So if I wanted to understand where are the larger bodied species, you see that the larger bodied species, which is the species with the big bubbles, are found more in protected areas, and the smaller species are found more in the community managed land. So it doesn't necessarily mean that only the large and important species are found in protected areas and there are no important species that are found in community managed lands. Because if you overlay the threatened status about, where are the endangered species, and those are the ones in red, you find that community managed lands have small and important endangered species that exist there as also protected areas. So what that means is that it's important to look at species across regimes. So it's important to look at species at the level of the landscape, or not really only at the level of what exists in a tiger reserve, but also beyond. And it's also, from that pictorial representation, it's also important to understand what are the individual narratives of species beyond that of tigers. So another important narrative that is sort of like a personal calling to me is because I've been lucky to go on a series of plant walks by a mentor, friend and colleague, Dr. Usha Desai, who has also recently in the last couple of years has also opened this new and beautiful world to me of looking not only beyond faunal species, but also looking at flora. And again, this is a nice quote actually that I found from Kailash Sankla's writing, where he talks about the Himalayas, and he says, overwhelmed by the grandeur of the landscape, the freshness of the air of the Himalayas, and the beauty of the flowers, the most splendid Mughal emperor Shah Jahan explained, if there's paradise on earth, it is this, it is this, it is this. And this is just one example of some of the amazing plants, some of the amazing floral species that are found in Pake. And some of these floral species are not only important trees, but they are also important to animals, because a lot of animals and birds eat some of these species. And this is actually an example of the great hornbill's diet and what it eats in Pake, which includes a diversity of large-seeded fruit species. And why? And then why is it important to appreciate some of these plant-animal interactions? Is that we are seeing that they're world over. If you look at distance from edge, so in the blue are places that have large patches of forests, and in the red are places where that have actually much smaller patches of forest. And you see that these large patches of forest only exist today in places like South America and Africa, and in some of the forests and the landscapes we work in, we're already working with highly fragmented forests. So it's important to understand the effects of fragmentation. It's also important to appreciate some of these plant-animal interactions that exist. And especially because some of these plant-animal interactions in primary forests versus fragmented forests are very different. So in the blue here, you can see undisturbed forests, and they have lots of animals and plants interacting with each other. You can look at the density of the black here, and you'll notice that there are lots of animals. There's a lot of connectivity between different species, and here, where forests are exist in fragments, this is much simplified. And some of the same species that exist, exist here may also play a key role in the ecosystem, right? So it's not only, while the tiger might be a mascot and a flagship, there might be species like the people or the fig species that are keystone species, which exist in at low densities, but have a disproportionate impact on the ecosystem. So the reason that they are called keystone species is that, if you take this bit out, they have downstream effects on the entire ecosystem. And if this were the different species that interacted with your keystone, you take this keystone out, this entire web would collapse. So coming to so while we have to look beyond fauna and also look at flora, appreciate some of those plant-animal interactions. So one of the other take-home messages that I had was that it's also important to look beyond that narratives that just fit the tiger. And I just thought I would share some of the incredible camera trap images that we have from Pake Tiger Reserve. And this is a leopard that was camera trapped on that was camera trapped on Christmas Day. This was another one 2 days later that took a different step. And this is my friend Kiram, who took almost the same step a few hours later, 6:26 a.m. and 10:30 a.m. This was more recent, of some interesting camera trap pictures of a leopard. Yes. Then it walks back, the individual walks back, and this individual takes almost the entire, follows back, taking the same steps. Pake has some amazing pictures of leopards. The leopard data has not been analyzed yet for the number of individuals that exist in the capture-recapture framework, and we hope that we could do that at some point. And yeah, I'm just going to show you all some of these. And so this is a leopard stalking something. We don't know what it was, but I've also just overlaid some of these interesting pictures that we have got with some of the readings from Burton and Sankla. So both of them, this was Burton who says both tigers and leopards sometimes indulge in pure diet, and where they talk about how a lot of them actually have eaten porcupines, and porcupines end up hurting these tigers and leopards. And this is a picture of a porcupine. This is what Burton says about a very interesting observation that I thought I'd share with you all. He says, on the same day, I saw a porcupine walking between two sitting tigers. One of them stood up and followed, but the spiny creature showed no anxiety, and after walking a few steps, the tiger returned. Pake also has some amazing camera trap images of wild dogs. There has been a PhD study that has been done on wild dogs. And wild dogs are quite a despised species exists that people don't like, and this is similar to other parts of India. And Kailash Sankla tries to defend wild dogs, and a lot of people don't like wild dogs. I guess it's because of the way in which they kill their prey. But this is what Kailash Sankla has to say. He says, wild dogs have been castigated for their cruel habits of eating the prey alive and are hated by everyone. But are they really so cruel? Death by drowning is not as painful, nor is a multiple attack on an excited animal. The action is so fast that the victim hardly has time to suffer before it is paralyzed and eaten. In the case of an unsuccessful attack by a tiger, the prey bleeds for half an hour or more, whereas a pack of wild dogs will finish everything, including eating the entire animal in less than an hour, and no bleating is heard. There've also been, this is one of, because there has been a history and a legacy of hunting where large-bodied prey is not as common. Diet analyses have shown that wild pigs are an important part of tiger and leopard diets. And there have been some wonderful pictures of wild pigs. So this is a wild pig with a Khalij pheasant on a camera trap. And this is another interesting excerpt I thought I would put here. So the wild boar is found all over the country, including the swamps of the Sundarbans. It is a fearless beast and goes to water holes without much anxiety about the possible presence of a tiger. The tiger is well aware of the boar's strength and ferocity, and normally does not accept a challenge. But there are several other excerpts which talk about how tigers have killed wild boar, and also how wild boar have retaliated against tigers and leopards. I think this is one of an example of not a wild boar retaliating, but this is an example of wild boar families. And the wild boar is known for its acute power of hearing and smell. It lives in small family groups. Both mother and father take care of the young. Solitary males are commonly seen and ejected from the groups. When boars fight for possession of a sow in heat, they stand on their hind legs to butt. This is something that I would love to see, but I have never seen. The battles are noisy and alert. The whole forest. So this is something that I've yet to see from any part of India, and something that I would definitely love to see in the coming days ahead. This is an example of gaur. Gaur are coming back to Pake and are quite frequently sighted through direct sightings. And this is an instance of from Kanha, about actually a gaur pushing two tiger cubs away from the herd with no fear of the tigress, who was sitting 50 feet away. This is a picture of an elephant, and elephants in Pake have smashed a lot of camera traps and have caused a lot of damage to camera traps. But their role has been acknowledged as ecosystem engineers again since the 1930s, in terms of creating trails along some of the paths, in terms of digging water holes in sandy river beds. And the elephant is another important species found here. There have been quite a few camera trap pictures of elephants, and more recently that of tuskers too. Again, a sign of recovery, where the frequency of tuskers has been going up in the camera trapping efforts that have gone on in the last 10 years. And fantastic pictures of smaller cats like the marble cat. So these are marble cat locations from two different places, and roughly at the same time, where we don't know when marble cats pair in Pake, but this is on the 1st of 19th of January, and this is on the 17th of January in two different locations. Maybe this is the time where marble cats pair. And different variations, coat variations of the golden cat. So the different morphs of the golden cat have also been quite spectacular in terms of the camera trapping efforts that we have done. And finding rare species also, like the Chinese pangolin. has also been pretty interesting to find them, although we've only had some 3 or 4 photos of this species in the last 10 years. So some of these explorations of what I showed you in this part of the talk tied to moving beyond the tiger and moving to some of these interesting prey and cat species. And there is much more work that needs to be done in this context. And, you know, since you all are also students who are will be doing dissertations at some point in life, I would also encourage you all to come to some of these landscapes and study some of these species or write about some of these species. The last and final thing I would like to talk about is that of social context of people and places and and people. And what I will talk about here is gender, inclusion, and the other stories that often remain untold in some of the narratives we talk about. So, for instance, even Kailash Sankla, who's done some pioneering work as the first Project Tiger director, I thought that I'd pull this out to also explain the role of important women in his life and the life of his father, who was also a forest ranger. So he says, my father lost his father at the age of 6 and was brought up by my grandmother, who earned a precarious living on our small farm. Although totally uneducated herself, she respected education and somehow managed to send her son to school, which was Kailash Sankla's father, who then went on to become a field surveyor and a forest ranger in training. And Kailash Sankla's own mother was very fond of keeping dairy and played an important role in supplementing some of the income, some of the family income that enabled Kailash Sankla and her father to do what they were able to do as forest rangers. And I hope that some of these stories and some of the contribution of some of these women is shown more proactively in some of the narratives we have around tigers. And also that, you know, some of the narratives we have around tiger conservation also point to the need for more empathy. So this is a story from the 1930s that I would just like to read out. It says, the poor woman came rushing from the village, calling her child, screaming out his name, but there was no answer. She became like one possessed with the idea that it was her child. She said, it is my child, my only child. I have done no harm to the tiger or anyone else. And the deity is unjustly angry with me. He killed my husband last year, and now he has devoured my child also. Then she screamed out, "Oh Ram Krishna," which was the name of her child. And she said, "Where are you?" And hearing no answer, she cried, "He has taken all I had," which is the tiger. "Let him take me also." And before the villagers could stop her, she rushed madly for the jungle to go and be eaten by the tiger. So this has been actually a very moving story that I read from the 1930s, and this is also some of the disproportionate effects that women who often go into the forests and collect firewood come in contact with respect to some of these large carnivores. And I hope some of the narratives we have around tigers and some of the work that we do around tigers also does include more empathy for humans in general, and also empathy across humans, especially for the times that we live in. So for instance, this is the tomb of a Mohammedan, of a Muslim saint from Banaras. I don't know where this is. I have been trying to search for any further references with respect to this tomb. But it says that a lamp of remembrance, formerly kept alight in the mausoleum, according to custom, was no longer burning. But both Muslims and Hindus believe that the tiger came every night and crouched close to the tomb, where it remained until the light of approaching dawn, and then scattered into flight as day broke out. And this is just an example I thought I would share with respect to tiger conservation, about having more empathy across humans, especially for the times that we live in. And finally, just to conclude, I would like to give you all a small example of that comes from Pake Tiger Reserve that sort of sums up this whole presentation. And that is that of Korotayam's tiger, the growling tiger, which was the Gaumbuda of Pake that I showed you all, one of the oldest tigers. And that was camera trapped by this forest guard and a close friend of mine, Korotayam, who got this iconic picture of a tiger. And it was so iconic that, I go back to some of the expressions of a tiger from some of the early writings of natural histories to understand where exactly this growling tiger fits. Is it a warning growl? Is it an angry dislike? And I often try to read about, what is this tiger actually trying to say? And this tiger has also made it to several of my writings and has been like almost that motivational tiger. Korotayam's tiger has been that motivational tiger for us to go on with the frontline anti-poaching staff in several articles that we have written. And unfortunately, Korotayam was killed by a wild elephant while returning from duty on Christmas Day. And he was killed by a wild elephant in 2014. And Korotayam's work and his legacy, along with that of the tiger, we've tried to work with people from across the board about what are the best ways to memorialize some of his contributions to Pake Tiger Reserve, because it is people like him who have made places like a Pake Tiger Reserve be what they are. So they have been the mascots of some of Korotayam's tiger. The Gaumbuda has been the mascot of some of the merchandise, some of the uniform batches that have been created. This is his widow, who has spent a substantial amount of time trying to rebuild her life. And we also have tried to take Korotayam's contribution and forward in terms of creating this outreach program called Polling for Pake, where we get people from all across India to help Pake pick its best images, where people from all across India vote for their favorite camera trap images. This is an example of polling based on which they are given a prize by the principal chief conservator of forests who comes and visits Pake. And while this is an ongoing effort, which is called Polling for Pake as of now, this also is a way where we are trying to rebuild, we are trying to internalize and memorialize what loss and contributions mean for a tiger reserve. And for instance, this was the 10 years of camera trapping in Pake Tiger Reserve, one of the reports scientific report that we came up with, which was dedicated to Korotayam. A lot of the growling tiger is often a favorite among the children of forest watchers who work around the tiger reserve. And we've also had a crowdfunding campaign with the growling tiger and with Polling for Pake that has also allowed us to have a crowdfunding campaign for his wife to help rebuild her house. And I'm happy to say that this crowdfunding campaign was made possible by one of my colleagues, Shraddha Rathod, who really took this on. And today, Korotayam's wife has a house for her, some of the family's income. Yes, and that's all I have to say, and I'm happy to take questions. I have actually several of my colleagues from Pake today. I have the range forest officer who has joined. His name is Kime Rambya. I have somebody else from my team, Deepa and Julie Jerang. So Deepa, Julie, if you all have anything to add, Ramya sir, if you have anything to add, please go ahead and ask or add. Are there any questions meanwhile?
Ma'am, I have a question. Ma'am, have you seen the movie Sherni?
I haven't yet.
Ma'am, in this context, I want to ask, what is the procedure to shoot a tiger, a man-eating tiger?
What is the procedure to shoot a man-eating tiger is it's not as easy, or it's not as easy, like not everybody can shoot a man-eating tiger, but you require special permission under the Wildlife Protection Act, and you also need to show that this tiger has declared intent to eat. So you can't speculate that it is a man-eating tiger. And then after that, once you get permission from the principal chief conservator of forest, a license is issued through which you can get, through which there is a shooter who puts down the animal. In some cases, translocates.
Thank you, ma'am.
There's one more question by Harsha. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, ma'am. So, am I audible?
Yes, Harsha.
Yes.
Okay, so I have heard a lot about, when you go out in the forest and how you can encounter poachers and how dangerous it gets because they tend to be pretty aggressive and at times, would try to hunt you down to subdue you. So, is that the reality and how do you deal with poachers? Because I know that tigers are poached a lot everywhere around the world.
So, Harsha, if you don't mind, if there is Ramya sir, can you unmute and would you be able to answer this? Because I think there's no better person to answer this than a range forest officer who I work very closely with.
Yeah, Pake has its own stories. Thankfully, it is in history. There has been lots of crossfires with poachers, and we have also lost many of our frontline guards in crossfire with poachers. So it's kind of because these poachers also come for hunting of big animals. So they have also they also come with all armed weapons and these guns. So it's and because these poachers also they are also very they are very familiar with the landscape in the forest, where to ambush the animals from, and they are also like very knowledgeable about the forest. Because to hunt an animal like tiger, the person will have to have a very good knowledge of forest. So they also know this forest very well. So it is kind of really risky. It's a kind of 50-50 for if suppose you meet some group of a poacher and they are also moving around with guns. So it's kind of who sees you first, who sees who the other first. So in sometimes they run away, sometimes they retaliate firing, but thankfully with all the efforts from our previous field director Tanatapi and the team he built up, so it's the situation is a lot better now. It's not like the encounter with the poachers also have reduced very marginally. So earlier it was like frequently there were poachers moving around, but things are a lot better now.
Okay, thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, Sadia, please go ahead with your question.
Hello, ma'am. I would like to know, is there any way to get friendly with lions and tigers? Because I love to do so. I've seen videos, but I don't know if it can actually happen.
I would encourage you not to, if you want to stay alive. And actually, I would encourage you, in terms of this question that constantly comes to me is the aspect of seeing a tiger. Like everybody is like, have you seen a tiger in Pakke? Actually, the not seeing a tiger is the most enchanting part of a rainforest because you know that there is an animal that is there. And it is literally how good your field tracking skills are, how present you are in that landscape. And I would say that is being fully present in the forest that you are in and fully observant is the best way to befriend a landscape and befriend an animal.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
I would
Julie.
encourage really to the colleagues, ma'am, your colleagues to come ahead and speak.
Sure. Julie, would you like to introduce yourself and introduce your work?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Good evening, all of you. My name is Julie Jerang. Basically, I'm from Siang district. There is one of the districts in Arunachal Pradesh. So I have been like associated with Nandini since 2019. And the work started here in Pake Tiger Reserve itself. It was on a project called THETA, that is towards health, equity, and transformative action on tribal health. Basically, for the people, the tribal people live around in and around Pake Tiger Reserve. So it was with the help of, according to that study, we have done a comparative study in between the STs and non-STs on the status of socioeconomic and health. So it has been done, and now we are working on, as Nandini has said, like as an outreach program on the human dimension on that base. So here we are I'm working on conducting focus group discussion with the frontline forest staffs, especially for their mental health. So it has been already done with the categorical group. So it was common for all the frontline staff, and with the wives of the frontline staff, the interview has been taken, and the frontline staff, those who are working staying in the far area, in the remote area, and the oldest staff from the frontline staff, and the newest, and the staff, those who have COVID positive this time. So on their motivation to work in protecting the reserve. So we are planning to have to write an article on the motivation to work towards the conservation, like even after having all these circumstances. So most of the individual group of individuals of the frontline staff some are the school dropout, some are they used to work in factories, and some are those who have staying with the seniors. So they have different kind of views towards what the in the previous time they have not known well about the conservation and all things, but now they have, because in Arunachal, as Nandini has said, we have we have what to say, we have a very kind of things like hunting ritual things happen since generations. So some of the protectors in this Pake Tiger Reserve are used to be a hunter. So now they have changed their this one thinking thoughts, and they have more towards conserving the wild animals. So it's a very interesting thing. So I hope to get this article done soon, so that all of you can have a look at it. So that's all. That's what we are working on right now. Thank you so much for
Thanks,
the
Julie.
opportunity. Yeah.
So Julie and Kimmy Ramya are speaking to you all from Pake today. And Julie has written several articles. Julie and Ramya have written several articles about Pake and the people there that I would encourage all of you to Google and read. Very interesting field narratives from the field. And lastly, I think we have Deepa. Deepa, would you like to introduce yourself and a bit about your work?
I'm Deepa. I am basically from Kerala. I've completed my PhD and as well as postdoc, and worked with indigenous communities in Kerala. After that, I joined in the project with Nandini and Dr. Prashant. This project is basically to set up a planetary information center that is actually the conservation aspect of the life of the communities who live in and around Pake. And actually that this project is basically a collaborative work done by the Institute of Public Health, Srishti, and the Forest Department, Forest Range Parque. And in the project, basically the students from Srishti, they actually designed a lot of ideas to implement in the Planetary Health Information Center. That ideas are theme-based ideas ranging from the traditional food of the indigenous communities there, and the hunting, the waste management, the human wildlife conflict, the tourism, and all of these various themes they have been working. And the almost they have designed their ideas to execute in the Planetary Information Center, that they have submitted the project. And now that this process is going on to execute that in the Planetary Information Center that is going to set up in Pake Tiger Reserve. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, ma'am, for speaking out, and thank you, ma'am, for taking out the time and doing this guest lecture with us. It was indeed very enlightening, and I hope everyone is taking something from this. And I would also like to thank Nature Club and PSA and your colleagues for joining us. It was a great honor to have you here. Thank you so much. And I would please encourage all the participants to fill out the feedback form.
Sakshi, there's a question in the chat box.
All right, I'm sorry, I missed it. Okay, ma'am, there are two questions. The
Okay.
first one is, will environmental impact assessment bring any harmful changes to Pake?
So the environment, you mean the amendments, I'm assuming. So the environment impact assessment studies that are done in India today are, as it is, substandard, and they are done by only a subset of authorized groups that are given permission to do so. And further changes will definitely, and further amendments to the EI will definitely have a negative effect for multiple other places, but especially for places like Arunachal Pradesh, where because they are on the border of India and China, as part of the amendments, they have said that a lot of these projects don't require any assessments altogether. So it's not only a harmful change, it's a disaster for the Northeast if they go in the present form.
There's one more by Harsha. We have seen there are even animals like lions can be infected with COVID-19. Has the pandemic impacted Pake in any way?
So the pandemic, I recently wrote an article for Third Pole about how the pandemic has affected Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary, which is adjacent to Pake. So that is a slightly longer read, but the sum of it is that one, there are, in terms of food security compared to living in other rural areas which do not have food security with respect to access to forests, there is definitely an advantage to living close to a forest, because you can at least get vegetables and you can at least get some basic of food security. In terms of livelihoods that are based on tourism and livelihoods that are based on agricultural produce, they have been negatively affected by COVID. And there is a study that was published in 2021, in early 2021, of which I was a part of, where we interviewed people from across India, and there has been an increase in hunting, at least a perceived increase in hunting across multiple districts in India. One is because people are back home, have more time, and two is also the aspect of nutritional security.
Okay, all right. Thank you, ma'am. Are there any more questions?
Nope, there are none.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am, again.